get to introduce the first presenter of the Emerging Issues Forum, and it's called Emerging Issues for a reason. We are looking for those new, innovative ideas that are going to carry our market forward. And that's just exactly what we're going to hear from my good friend, David Hallberg. Let me introduce you to David Hallberg. For many of you, he probably doesn't need any introduction. He has been around for quite a long time. He is and has been a warrior for ethanol for over 35 years. He is a South Dakota native, headed out to the West or East Coast for college, received his Master of Arts degree in International Relations and Economics from the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies in Washington, D.C. He then went to work at the United States Senate and House of Representatives, serving as a legislative director and chief of staff for many notable senators and congressmen, including Senator Tom Daschle, who is very famous in our industry. David founded and served as the first president, CEO of the Renewable Fuels Association, which has continued, obviously, to be a very strong advocate for ethanol. He's the inventor of 3 U.S. patents to produce high-octane ethanol with a radically reduced carbon footprint. Hallberg is a former business representative on the Nebraska Ethanol Board and a recipient of many prestigious awards, including the American Coalition of Ethanol Grassroots Award and the Merle Anderson Award. David's now going to share details about the high-octane low-carbon initiative and explain why now is the opportune time to coalesce around this initiative.
Thanks, Pam, for those kind words. I appreciate it very much. I'd like to thank Roger and you, the Nebraska Ethanol Board and Renewable Fuels Nebraska, for giving us this opportunity to talk to you today. On behalf of Doug Durrani, the Executive Director of Clean Fuels Development Coalition, and former Senate Majority Leader Tom Daschle, who wishes he could be here today, I want to thank you for the chance to talk about one of what we think is a very important emerging issue. Roger asked me to speak about what Senator Daschle has been doing and will be doing over the next weeks and months in Washington, D.C. To repeal and replace the Trump safe rule and encourage the transition to a national 98 100 RON higher octane gasoline standard that requires high octane low carbon fuels such as E30. Next slide, please. Thank you. This is a very, very timely event because the new Biden administration, as we know, is undertaking in its first 100 days some major decisions that will have a major impact on the U.S. transportation fuel sector and ethanol's future. Clean Fuels Development Coalition and its supporters, which include Farmers Union Enterprises, Glacial Lakes Energy, which, as you know, is the driver behind Watertown E30 Challenge, Siouxland Ethanol, Elite Octane, and Little Sioux Corn Processors, are working in partnership with National Farmers Union and other industry stakeholders to support former Senate Majority Leader Tom Daschle's reconstituted high-octane low-carbon alliance. The primary objective of the alliance is to persuade the Biden-Harris administration to expeditiously promulgate a national clean octane standard as part of a strategy to repeal and replace the Trump safe rule. This will encourage an orderly transition from nationwide E10 to nationwide E30 Hulk fuels, and the precedents are the transition from leaded to unleaded gasoline in the 1980s and the transition from E1 to E10 as a result of the Renewable Fuels Standard in the 2005 to 2010 period. Next slide, please. The governor's announcement last week of the EPA-sanctioned Nebraska E30 demonstration project will provide an important impetus to Tom Daschle's HOLCA action plan. As you all know, and as the governor has mentioned, one of ethanol's major advantages over electric vehicles is its time to market advantages. A critical component of the HOLCA Clean Octane Action Plan is that the ethanol industry can't afford to wait another 15 years for the 270 million light-duty vehicles on the road to turn over to flex fuel vehicles. EPA took the incentives for those off the table in the final Tier 3 rule. And so we need to be able to show, and have shown, that standard vehicles on the road today operate just fine on E30 blends. Next slide, please. I was privileged to serve, as Pam has mentioned, on the Nebraska Ethanol Board for 11 years. And I saw firsthand just how critical its activities and leadership are. For 40 years, the NEB has advanced issues critical to the corn ethanol industry. Certainly the UNL gas haul million-mile demonstration project in 1978 was absolutely critical to EPA's approval of the first E10 substantially similar waiver. I was chief of staff to Congressman Berkeley Bedell at the time from Iowa. We worked closely with the Carter White House and his EPA administrator, Doug Kostel. I can assure you that without the Nebraska work, that waiver would never have been issued. It was pretty cool in 1989 to watch Todd Sneller brief President of the United States, George H.W. Bush, about what was going on in Nebraska as the president was making his tour promoting his 1990 Clean Air Act amendments. The president even pronounced ethanol's ether, ethyl tertiary butyl ether, flawlessly 3 times. Next slide, please. Dreams can and sometimes do become reality. Roger's letter to the producers about what the end game of the E30 demonstration project is, I thought was spot on. And to inspire a transition from nationwide E10 blends to nationwide E30 blends, just as the Nebraska million-mile gas haul demonstration did with E10 in 1978. You can't achieve something if at first you don't dream. And I know many people believe E30 is a bridge too far. I understand that. It seems like a huge number. But I remember in 1999 when Senators Daschle and Lugar introduced the first RFS, that most people, even ethanol supporters, thought that was never going to happen. Today, we have nationwide E10, both market and certification fuel as a result. Next slide, please. I can tell you that 40 years ago, we just opened the doors of the Renewable Fuels Association, January 1981. Ronald Reagan had just defeated Jimmy Carter. Oil had crashed to $9 a barrel. The hostages had returned from Iran. Most of the ethanol being sold in the US at the time was being imported from Brazil. ICM and POET had still not brought their dry milling technology breakthroughs to market. And ethanol, frankly, depended on tax incentives, which the oil industry basically felt that we were on life support and it was time to deliver the lethal blow. This ad you see here on the left was run in Sioux Falls Argus Leader in 1986, but it was a nationwide campaign in every state of the union where they did skull and crossbones to say no alcohol in our, quote, pure gasoline. They actually did us a favor because it backfired. And people like freshman Senator Tom Daschle hooked up with unlikely bedfellow, at the time, Vice President Bush's counsel, C. Boyden Gray, a very good friend. And we mounted a concerted offensive against carcinogenic gasoline aromatics. which ultimately snowballed and culminated in the successful Daschle-Dole clean octane floor amendment after months of debate by an enormous margin of 69 to 30. Next slide, please. So EPA would like us in the press to believe that the U.S. transportation sectors and the mobile source emissions problems are largely due to diesel fuels. That's not the case. Obviously, the U.S. gasoline market is the world's largest. Gasoline dominates diesel by factors of 3 to 4. And it just so happens that the 25 to 30% fraction of a typical gallon of gasoline is the octane portion coming from aromatics or benzene, toluene, ethyl benzene, and xylene, BTEX. That fraction is the most carcinogenic, toxic, carbon intensive, and expensive fraction of gasoline. And that's where ethanol shines. Next slide, please. So today we're going to quickly review what I believe are the 3 critical inflection points for the corn ethanol industry. The first is the 1990 Clean Air Act. The second was 15 years later in the 2005 Energy Policy Act. And the third is what we're addressing today, which is the 2021 revised SAFE rule. Next slide, please. Well, as we know, the history of gasoline has really been a function of how can you get cost-effective and technically effective octane boosters into the gasoline pool. It's hard to believe, but 100 years ago, we were basically having the same fight we are now when Henry Ford was taking on John Rockefeller and warning the nation's policymakers that if you went ahead and used tetraethyl lead to boost gasoline octane, which the automakers needed to increase their compression ratios, that there would be hell to pay on the environmental health side. Henry Ford specifically advocated for E30 plus. That was his sweet spot. There's great literature out there as to how he rationalized that and the benefits. Unfortunately, John Rockefeller and his lobbyists prevailed. Next slide, please. So I apologize, this is a busy slide, but you folks know all this anyhow. The bottom line is that by any measure, ethanol's octane properties are superior to aromatics, as well as less costly. But from whether it's ethanol's blending octane value in excess of 130, its sensitivity benefits, what it does as more ethanol is added to reduce the blend's volatility, and of course the emissions reductions, which are enormous. Ethanol is just heads and shoulders superior to the aromatics that refiners synthesize out of crude oil. An increasing benefit of ethanol these days that has kind of been under the radar, but we're going to talk about a little more later on, is what a nationwide E30 standard would do to reduce oil imports. A billion barrels per year. It's mind-boggling for those of us who started here 40 years ago and we hardly had any ethanol domestically at all. At $100 a barrel, which prices are now marching towards, that's $100 billion per year, or $1 trillion over a decade. Absolutely astounding, and numbers that the Biden administration economic advisors will not be able to overlook. Next slide, please. So it's a distant memory to many of us, even old guys like me, but it used to be that everybody used leaded gasoline to power their automobile. And even though all the way back to the Romans, when they drank wine from leaded goblets, we knew just how bad it was for humans. A truly astounding study by United Nations quantified the economic and societal costs of leaded gasoline, annual costs, over 1 million deaths, 322 million lost IQ points, millions of crime cases, and a US dollar 2.4 trillion per year GDP loss. It's just mind-boggling how bad that was and the cost that imposed on society. And as EPA began to phase out leaded gasoline, when we opened the doors of RFA, that process had begun. Many experts warned that aromatics were as bad or more likely worse than lead. Next slide, please. So inflection point one was the 1990 Clean Air Act amendments, which involved months of intensive debate on the floor of the Senate and the House. The ad off to the right ran in Time magazine and a number of national publications. The API and the oil industry spared no expense. It was a massive campaign. And you can see some of their lines: won't cure smog, it's going to harm your car, and $1 billion subsidy, and why should you let politicians write a chemical formula? They tried really, really hard, and I think I remember those days very well. I think they thought they were going to win, but they didn't. Not only did they not win, the vote on the Senate floor, they lost 69-30. These days, I don't think you could get 69 votes for a Mother's Day resolution in the Senate, but it was a massive victory for ethanol, and it proved just how much of an Achilles heel the aromatics issue is for the oil industry. That is their soft underbelly, and no matter how much money they spend, it's very, very hard, if not impossible, for them to convince people that you should put that in gasoline. Next slide, please. So we all know the history for whatever set of reasons, and we're not exactly sure yet today why, but there are a handful of very powerful bureaucrats in Ann Arbor with the group called Office of Technology and Air Quality, Office Transportation and Air Quality, I'm sorry, OTAC. Know those guys, they've been there for over 30 years. They have enormous influence over regulatory decisions that impact automobiles and fuels. So billions of dollars of decisions come off their pen. And this slide's most important for the last bullet, which is, in this case, this is the one thing that they said that was correct. They asserted that they couldn't comply with the congressional mandate under Section 202L, which is the mobile source air toxics provision, to replace aromatics with ethanol because there simply was not enough ethanol to fill the gap. And at the time, that was a true statement. They were supposed to be working to help correct that problem, but unfortunately, they never did that. Next slide, please. So inflection point number two, Tom Daschle and his colleagues and his supporters decided to call EPA's bluff. Not enough ethanol, let's do something about it. So in the 2005 Energy Policy Act, which included the first renewable fuel standard, 7.5 billion gallons, it also included something very important, which is they doubled down on the Section 202L mobile source air toxics provision. So first we talk about repeal and replace. At the time, they repealed the reformulated gasoline MTBE program because of the water contamination issues that it caused. And they replaced it with the first renewable fuel standard, which mandated a nationwide ethanol use program. The refiners at the time made a desperate bid to eliminate Section 202L and the MSAP provision, arguing that because of the RFS, it was no longer necessary. Fortunately, Congress didn't buy that, and they doubled down and directed EPA to finally, after 15 years, promulgate a rulemaking within 18 months. EPA did meet the 18-month deadline. However, predictably, they used fallacious predicates. Cost-benefit analysis was ridiculous. They, for instance, assumed things like $19 barrel crude oil and used the assumption that it would be 2 gallons of ethanol to replace 1 gallon of toluene, which is actually the exact opposite. So obviously the cost-benefit analysis was not favorable at the time. Next slide, please. So I guess if there's one slide I hope you remember today, it's probably this one. Despite the negativity of EPA's 2007 final rule, there was a kernel of hope, because as they concluded the rulemaking, they had to do an assessment of potential health impacts of aromatics, which they admitted were bad. And they ended up saying that to the extent there are compelling reasons to do aromatics control in the future, it will come from the fact that we have evidence that there is a direct linkage of gasoline aromatics to secondary fine particulates formation. In other words, secondary organic aerosols. As a matter of fact, we now have that science. DOE's Pacific Northwest National Labs, EPA's MOVES model contractor, Desert Research Institute, among others, have confirmed that there is a direct linkage between gasoline aromatic hydrocarbons and secondary organic aerosols. Next slide, please. Okay, so we thought we had another bite at the apple in 2012 in the Tier 3 rule. The proposed rule gave us hope. EPA praised E30's octane properties, asked for comment on how to make that a reality. Lots of comments were received, but they, as usual, ignored them. Final rule did nothing but reduce sulfur. But there was a positive that came out of that experience as well, too, because to the credit of Urban Air Initiative and their attorneys, Boyd and Gray and Associates, there was an extensive Freedom of Information Act investigation in which dozens of internal EPA emails were disclosed, and they reveal inappropriate, many people believe unlawful, interaction between EPA and oil industry representatives. Next slide, please. So now EPA has a problem. The RFS, enacted in 2005 and then expanded in RFS 2 in 2007, has resulted in a very robust and effective ethanol production program. The new technologies by ICM and POET have put the cost competitiveness of corn ethanol to the point where tax incentives are not necessary. There are billions of gallons out there. And now we find that EPA has to come up with something to justify why they're not replacing carcinogenic aromatics with ethanol. And so they came up with what I call unicorn fuels. They colluded with oil interests to manipulate their models. Steve Vandergen and others are experts on how they've done that. They relied upon manipulated test fuels that will never be sold in the marketplace. designed by oil industry, Chevron, and other scientists. And they basically pinned the very harmful emissions products from aromatics on ethanol. To this day, they still have not admitted that their atmospheric models are defective. Next slide, please. So almost by luck, we ran across a 2015 workshop that was buried in the literature where EPA scientists finally confessed to the linkage between aromatics, secondary organic aerosols, and polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons that are tied to them. It was a smoking gun. They finally confessed that their models are totally defective. They admit that PAH has weaponized the secondary organic aerosols, so they insulate them, preserve them, and insure them for long-range transport. So it's kind of, frankly, shocking. All three of their key assumptions are dead wrong. First, they said that PAHs dissipate within 300 meters. They fall out. There's no long-range transport or persistence. Totally wrong. They said that advanced vehicle emissions systems, catalytic converters, would capture SOA-bound PAHs. Totally wrong. In fact, it's even worse. Direct injection engines, the advanced engines of the future that automakers are looking to help with fuel efficiency, make SOA-bound PAHs worse. They exacerbate them significantly. And last, EPA claimed that if you use more ethanol, this is their MOVES model claim, that it will produce more PAH-bound toxics. Again, totally wrong. It's the exact opposite. Higher ethanol blends significantly reduce SOA-bound PAH emissions. Still, EPA has not admitted that their models are defective. This is where Senator Daschle will be working very hard with EPA's new administrator, Michael Regan, who in his confirmation hearing promised the committee that his agency would be driven by science and driven by the rule of law. And if that's the case, they're going to need to tell OTAC to move out of the way. Next slide, please. So this brings us to the last inflection point, which is the revised 2021 SAFE rule, which we believe offers the ideal vehicle to address multiple EPA challenges and the barriers that they put in front of ethanol's clean octane. Surprisingly enough, in its 2019 proposed rule, Trump EPA specifically requested comment on how best it can encourage a national higher octane gasoline standard, quote, consistent with Title II of the Clean Air Act, which is where Section 202L resides. CFDC and other comments made it clear that because of what's called the maximum achievable control technology standard in the Act that Congress imposed in 1990, the only real legally permissible regulatory outcome is to reduce or replace gasoline aromatics with E30, 100 RON, high octane, low carbon fuels. And that's because you get the maximum reductions in the toxics, the black carbons, et cetera, even compared E25 to E30. All the pieces are or can be easily put in place: vehicles, infrastructure, ethanol supply. And the way we avoid the inevitable congressional gridlock is to simply compel EPA to enforce the statute, which is mandatory, that's already on the books. Day one of the Biden administration, Executive Order number 9 identified SAFE rule as one of the top priorities for repeal and replace. And that window is now ticking, that 100-day window of opportunity. National Farmers Union et al. And their attorneys in Larson King and St. Paul filed the SAFE rule amicus brief in January 2021. The final slide of this deck contains a link to that brief if you care to look at it. and it urges EPA's expeditious correction of the Trump rule errors. Next slide, please. Okay, so that kind of brings us to where we are and what we want to do with Senator Daschle and a guy who's been a champion of our industry for nearly 40 years. Serendipitously enough, Senator Daschle's targets include many former colleagues and or employees from the Senate Majority Leader days. Obviously, President Biden, Tom and Joe Biden worked very closely in the Senate for years. President Biden's chief of staff, Ron Klain, worked for Tom Daschle in the Senate Majority Leader's office for years. They have a great working relationship. Daschle and Vilsack, Secretary Granholm, others, he's held in high regard and they respect his knowledge and his honesty. Next slide, please. So one of the things that encourages us is that Ron Klain has established a pod structure within the White House to discipline the climate team deliberations, to help prevent stovepiping. And Senator Daschle and his team have drawn up the target list. An example would be Brian Deese, who's the head of National Economic Council, used to be chief of staff to DOE Secretary Ernie Moniz. He's going to care about the numbers involved in the trade deficit reductions from a nationwide E30 program, for instance. Next slide, please. Mentioned the oil import displacement and trade deficit benefits. Senator Daschle is very, very aware of that. He'll be hitting that hard, among others, and I think it's a huge opportunity for our industry. Compared to fracking, we're way ahead of the game. Next slide, please. So we know that EPA is way behind. Their science is obsolete and outdated. We need a new benefit cost analysis in addition to the health implications and the trade deficit. They need to look at the carbon numbers, which are hugely in corn ethanol's favor. Next slide, please. This slide should be credited to Jeff Cooper, Renewable Fuels Association. He presented it last year at our United Nations Foundation Forum in DC. One picture is worth 1,000 words. It just makes it very clear that corn ethanol is on its way to a ultra low carbon fuel by 2030, if not before. Very dramatic numbers. Next slide, please. I spent years hearing about food versus fuel when I started RFA in front of congressional committees, and it's really never ceased. But Tom Daschle knows that that's a silly argument. People like Ron Alverson have been corresponding with Tom for years now. The recent Harvard study that was printed in the Wall Street Journal of all places about corn's prolific yields and environmental improvements as precision agriculture brings us, forward. It just shows that we're as good or better as electric vehicle battery technology with our technology improvements. Glacial Lake's Energy, Little Sioux with their carbon capture storage investments and others. Huge data point for Senator Daschle as he talks to Tom Vilsack and EPA Administrator Regan and climate czar Gina McCarthy, for that matter. So we have lots of weapons in our arsenal. Next slide, please. Again, we don't need to repeat these. You know them all. Doug Durrani calls E30 and ethanol a Swiss Army knife. I think it's a great analogy. You can just pull out any tool you want. There's no other industry or tool or issue I know of, having done this for 40 plus years, that's as eclectic and versatile and powerful as ethanol, whether it's agriculture or health or trade deficits or facilitating auto industry compliance. We can touch every button. Next slide, please. So to conclude here, the author of the first Renewable Fuels program, which has clearly been an enormous success. Everyone, you all should be very, very proud of what happened. I know Senator Daschle is proud. His view is that, declare victory and now look to move and put ethanol industry into orbit. Those of you who might have heard his panel at the Iowa Renewable Fuels Summit would have heard him this quote about RFS provided the launch and now E30 can keep us in orbit. All of these things to transition to a national high octane, low carbon E30 standard, whether it's cornstarch grind or 15 billion gallons or more ethanol demand, all of the good things, the quality jobs, those are all things that are unique to our industry. Next slide, please. So here are links if you have any interest to some of these reference materials. I guess I'd conclude by listing the 9 bullets that we call the COBRA plan, the Clean Octane Barrier Removal Action Plan that Senator Daschle carries around in his pocket. 1, repeal and replace the SAFE rule to establish a national 98 to 100 RON gasoline standard. 2, correct the EPA's interpretation, which we believe to be unlawful, of Section 211F of the Clean Air Act to permit the use of E30 in standard vehicles. 3, extend the 1 pound waiver to E10 plus blends. 4, accelerate and complete the build out of the infrastructure needed to support E15 to E30 fuels. 5, update the corn ethanol carbon footprint, life cycle analysis consistent with the GREET model. Approve an E30 certification fuel. Extend a pro rata credit to optimized E30 vehicles. Correct the MOVES model to reflect aromatic hydrocarbons contributions to SOA-bound PAHs and ethanol's ability to substantially reduce the same. And last, enforce the mandatory mobile source air toxic provision in Section 202L of the Clean Air Act. Again, I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you all today. If you have any questions, concerns about any of this, please feel free to reach out to either Doug Durante or myself. Thank you.
David, thank you for that great presentation. That was a lot of information and obviously very, very timely. There's a couple of questions that are popping up here that I want to go ahead and share with you and get your response on. So Barrett Manzoor asks, what's the best way forward when it comes to normalizing the use of higher ethanol blends, such as E30?
Well, I'd say just a continuation of what we heard last week from NEB and Governor Ricketts. Certainly the folks in Watertown and Glacial Lakes are continuing to move that forward. Dave Vandergren has his own program in Kansas. I think the governor was right. I think the more we demonstrate this on the ground, the more it's going to be clear to Mr. Regan and his EPA folks that this is just like it was in 1978 with E10. This fuel is good fuel for a car. And if they have a problem with emissions or whatever, they have a regulatory authority under 211C, not 211F. So the burden is on them to do the testing and prove that the fuel doesn't work.
Excellent. So as we had talked earlier this week, the timing is just critical right now. Could you explain that a little bit more about why now is exactly the right time to push forward with this, and how can we all help with this effort?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, Pam. Thank you. As you know, every 4 years, whether a new administration or a re-elected administration, they call it the first 100 days. And it typically, within that period of time, you come up with your initiatives, you prioritize what you think are really the things that have to happen, and you task your senior people with developing an implementation plan to make them reality. That's going on as we speak right now with the Biden administration. He's been especially active, as we've read, with executive orders because he's concerned about the gridlock in Congress. And so Senator Daschle has this, I think, unique opportunity and entree to get to the senior folks, including Chief of Staff Klain and Tom Vilsack and EPA Administrator Regan, and say, these are issues that you really need to make sure you're dealing with up front. So we don't, by the time we get to the midterms next year, we want to have this in place.
Excellent. I think it was on one of your slides. I think you mentioned it. The term environmental justice has been used from the Biden administration, especially in directing the EPA to consider things that affect and the environmental justice aspects of things. Can you discuss how that does or doesn't play well for our case with E30 and ethanol?
Yeah, I think I might have glossed over that, and I shouldn't have. It's critically important. Environmental justice is the linchpin. It's the centerpiece of the Biden-Harris, worldview. And they have actually directed the Biden climate team to use that as kind of a lodestar of how they look at decisions they make. It plays right into the E30 wheelhouse because the most dangerous urban pollutant is secondary organic aerosols and the PAHs that they carry. We have piles of science on that now, and there's even linkage to COVID. So one of the disservices that EPA has done to us is by underplaying that, by not measuring the emissions, by saying that they've got it cleaned up with the catalytic converter, is a lot of the health community don't realize just what a huge threat it is to disadvantaged youth in particular. And it's just like Dr. Birnbaum, who's the emeritus scientist of National Institute of Health, is on one of the slides. She said that PAHs are as bad or worse than lead for IQ, cognitive development, whatever. That's a message that Senator Daschle has to help us take to the very top of the food chain.
Excellent. Well, I know it's called the High Octane Low Carbon Alliance, and I think that's really important as we look at a 98 to 100 RON aspect of this, as well as a low carbon, be it a fuel standard or whatever that comes out to play. But looking forward to seeing a lot of support for this, a lot of different organizations coming around to also push this around and forward through the regulatory process. There's some efforts on the legislative side, and we know what the challenges are there as well. So, David, thank you very much for your presentation. Thank you for your years of work in the industry, and let's get this to the finish line.
Thank you for all you do, Pam. Thank you very much.